So greetings everyone, and welcome to what is the final substantive session of this workshop. And I congratulate you and thank you for staying the distance. For many of you, it's been a long day, and for some, a long night. And your persistence is appreciated, but I honestly think it will be rewarded because we have a fascinating panel ahead of us. This panel has a specific intention, which is to bridge across from the very rich insights that we've been harvesting over the previous sessions, and to recognize that while vaccines and access to vaccines is currently critically important and is an immediate determinant of public health outcomes, and an area where inequitable access is a deep concern, an immediate concern. It's all understood. But this cannot divert us entirely from the very real needs in other areas of medical technology. And so the purpose of this session is to open up that cross-fertilization between these areas and to get some very, very remarkable expert insights from other areas of related technologies. Areas of technology that have been very important in the past. You will remember in the early days of the pandemic, the scramble to get access to protective equipment. And this will become a complex issue in future as we trust a wide range of treatments will be approved and made available to deal with those infected with the virus. So that said, we won't be able to go into enormous detail, and we've encouraged our panelists in this session to again be quite brief, but really to bring forward some direct practical insights from their specific fields, and in particular to give us insights into these areas of technology that we can build on. Because as with other sessions, the intention today is not simply to have a very interesting, very enriching conversation, but to harvest understanding, to build networks, to strengthen dialogue, and to chart, as my colleague Ho has done very well, to chart the way ahead for practical cooperation. That's very much what we have in mind for this event. So there's a lot in front of us. You don't want to hear any more from me. I will refer you to the website and the program for details of the impressive CVs and background of our speakers, because I think you'd rather you had the insights from them directly. So with that, I'll pass the floor to our first speaker, Mr. Aaron Bernstein, who's Divisional Vice President, Procurement Technical Services at Abbott. Aaron, over to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you today. In the last 18 months, we've seen profound changes in how people access healthcare, from virtual doctor's appointments to drive-through vaccinations and at-home COVID testing. All these methods of care existed before the pandemic, but COVID created an unprecedented need for extensive, decentralized access to care and rapidly accelerated the shift. Traditionally, innovation-driven business has focused on delivering solutions to technical and medical challenges that improve health. But that's only part of the solution that we need. We also need that same level of innovation in addressing health-related infrastructure, R&D, and supply chain mechanisms. That means disrupting the market, not only with extraordinary breakthroughs in technology, but also in making sure that logistically we're prepared to help the greatest number of people. As the pandemic has shown, private industry can be a great innovator. From the vaccine and test makers to the companies that retrofitted their factories to produce PPE and ventilators, to the logistics and consulting companies that lent their expertise. COVID also created an unprecedented demand for testing. Suddenly, something that was historically seen as a medical diagnostics tool exclusively used for hospitals and labs was needed to support widespread public health while meeting individual patient needs as well. Businesses across the industry raced to create solutions. At Abbott, this pandemic pushed us to focus even more on speed and scale. When developing our COVID-19 tests, we threw out the notion that you can't have a test that is affordable, reliable, and scalable. Our teams quickly got to work, running around the clock, literally 24/7, developing products, working on procurement, building our supply chains, and rapidly increasing our manufacturing capacity. And now we've delivered more than 700 million tests globally to date that meet all three of those needs. We were able to accomplish these feats because we had the infrastructure in place and the know-how in-house. And for Abbott and other companies in our space, we want to be in an even better position to serve more people with better technologies so that when the next pandemic hits, we're in an even better position to help. One way we can do this is to adopt the guidance from the 100 Days Mission Report that the Partnership for Pandemic Preparedness recently presented the G7 leaders. In it are specific steps to reduce the impact of future pandemics by making diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines available within 100 days. Specifically, there are 3 areas mentioned in the report I'd like to highlight today. First, stimulate R&D and boost manufacturing capacity for diagnostics by using diagnostics as part of a business as usual healthcare and surveillance approach. This would improve care and help in the battle against antimicrobial resistance as well. I want to underline the importance of investing between pandemics to ensure innovation and industry investment is sustained, particularly for scaling up quickly in a crisis. Secondly, develop a common regulatory framework that better defines criteria and standards for effectiveness, quality, and use cases for diagnostics. Stringent regulatory authorities should work together to define international assessment protocols and develop guiding principles alongside more effective quality assurance processes that link diagnostic tests into care and prevention pathways. For diagnostics, the lack of high-quality regulatory pathways with clear specification and use cases has led to diagnostics of varying quality and government's use of tests in ways that were not intended. Inefficient and sometimes overly complex regulatory systems and processes slowed the activation and overburdened the conduct of clinical trials and hampered the implementation and adoption of their results. And finally, third, establish a close cooperation between the public and private sectors, linking surveillance of pandemic threats, including immediate and unhindered access to samples and data with the diagnostics industry between pandemics. This should also include working closely with existing industry-led initiatives, such as Abbott's Pandemic Defense Coalition, which brings together a scientific and public health network dedicated to the early detection and rapid response to future pandemic threats. Adopting frameworks like the 100 Days Mission Report are an integral part of improving the future of accessible and affordable testing, well beyond the COVID pandemic. When the right market conditions are in place, companies such as Abbott will already have the supply chains, technologies, and regulatory procedures in place so that we can scale up again, even better than before, to tackle the next pandemic. Thank you for your time today and for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you very much indeed. I think you've really brought home one of the most important insights I think we've all had at a very practical and personal level in the course of this pandemic, the central importance of diagnostics, not as an afterthought, but as an integral part of health surveillance. And as you mentioned, something that has to be borne in mind not only now as we scramble to catch up, but in the context of preparing for the inevitable future pandemics. We'll reserve time at the end of this session for your comments and questions, but do keep them coming. Do please respond through the 2 channels. so we can make the best use of our time. So with thanks then to Aaron, I'll then pass to our next speaker, also speaking with a rich experience of the diagnostics field, Carlos Eduardo Gouvêa, President of the Latin American Alliance for the Development of In Vitro Diagnostics. Carlos, please, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's a great pleasure to be here. I hope you hear me well. I just had to go for my plan B because my connection was lost. We had interruption of supply of energy, so let's see if we can move ahead. But basically, it's a great pleasure to be here and talk about mapping other COVID essential health technologies and trade. And like my predecessor, Aaron, I'm going to speak a lot on diagnostics. Aladiv is a network of different associations and entities, but basically it resumes to the very important collaboration of industry, academy, and government officers, exactly in order to accelerate access to diagnostics through regulatory convergence and also quality issues and so on. If we think about the diagnostic world, it has been evolving very fastly. We used to think of diagnostic as only reagents at one time, then reagents and instruments. Nowadays, it's a complete overall system composed of reagents, system, IT, and instruments all together, and from all different sizes. As you can see here, lots of new developments have been made in point-of-care solutions, and also smaller devices like the rapid tests available everywhere. They are embedded with high-profile technology, if we see. But it's not only the technology itself in the instruments and reagents, but if we think about integrating everything through IT networks, we can really take the solutions everywhere and for every kind of need. It can be epidemiological support to public health decisions. It can be for a hospital or lab to bring the results to patients as soon as they are ready in order to promote even faster access to the therapies. It doesn't matter. The fact is that we are now in the Health 4.0 era. We are really looking forward to a fully integrated system. If we come with an example that I would like to bring here, example of Brazil, where I am. Back in March 2020, we were really afraid that we couldn't cope with the pandemic because there was not enough, there was no reagent available in the market, and they would take quite a while, especially because Anvisa, our regulator, is quite an stringent regulatory authority. So it would take time. So in terms of strategy, we had a three-pillar strategy: access, quality, and mass testing. Access, it was really, we came close to Anvisa and discussed the need of a kind of emergency use authorization regulation. So the existing resolutions at the time should be amended or changed. And they did it very quickly, not only for registration purposes, but also GMP and imports. So regulatory convergence and reliance on existing rules, it's quite an important tool for this kind of situation. As a matter of fact, with these changes, Anvisa has registered over 633 products. Some of them are the same by different importers. But anyway, we had all the technologies available in a short period of time. Then it came the question, what about quality? Many are new manufacturers that we have no clue, we have no idea, no track record. So we established a local consortium with the medical societies, the industry association, both medical societies and laboratory association, together with 13 public and private labs that had access to real-life patients. As a conclusion of using the same kind of protocol in every lab, we could have performance data evaluated. And as a conclusion, we had over 16,000 samples evaluated. And what were the outcomes? Well, for the market, we had a reference of performance of these different products available. For the Anvisa, they had post-market surveillance data. And for the manufacturers themselves, they had a very important feedback in order to promote changes and improvements in their production facilities and systems. So the next batch was much better than the previous one. And last but not least, the third pillar would be mass testing. Everyone was counting on the government to take this role ahead, and not only with PCR, but rapid tests, initially antibody, and nowadays with antigen. But that's actually, it was unfortunately not enough for many reasons. We had switch of different ministers in our government, interruption of certain programs. So it was important to have the private sector together with us. We were talking initially for diagnostics, an environment of 6,000 hospitals, 18,000 labs, but that was not enough for over 220 million people. So how to take this step ahead, extra mile? Drugstores and pharmacies were then authorized to do inter-premises evaluations, deployment of rapid tests. And with that, we have this kind of charts and scenarios here. That's what the Pharmacy Association has been offering to the market. So basically, we were able then to reach the invisible person where they are in the far parts of Brazil and giving very important information. So with this, I would come, and the most important part is actually going to be with the questions and answers, but it's important to note that for diagnostics, there is no perfect diagnostic test. There is always the right test to be used in the right patient, in the right place, and at the right time. This combination of tools is going really to provide the correct information in order to improve access to the right therapies. So diagnostics can be a very important tool for public health policy and in order to promote the right and fast way back to the normal economy. But as you know, we have to take some legacies from this very intense experience. So first question, are we prepared for the next pandemic? Are we considering the One Health approach, animal, human health and environment? Are we taking seriously this important integration among academy, industry and government? That's more important than ever. And should we also think about, and that's a good discussion, about the global value chains in the new format? Should we have only global, but what about the localizing some of the structures? These new arrangements of production should be also considered. We should have expertise in the local places. So this regional collaboration is essential, and convergence of regulation is the most important part of that. So what I would invite you all to check is this new publication that we have launched 2 weeks ago, the Laboratory Diagnostics White Book, where we take the life cycle of diagnostics and come with the bottlenecks we face with very good and interesting proposals. That's a very good exercise because actually the future is in our hands, and Ladiv and our network of associations and collaborators are ready to serve you all and work together with you. Congratulations for the event, and it's a pleasure to be here once again.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and you've really superbly complemented the presentation of Aaron and really given us a grassroots perspective about the reality of developing and disseminating new diagnostics at a critical time. And one point I take away from your presentation is the idea of integration. You made the point that diagnostics themselves are integrated technologies. You mentioned the reagents, the IT, the instruments, rather than seeing these in an isolated fashion. And likewise, the role of diagnostics and their contribution to the One Health policy is also integrated with other aspects. I think another point of integration that you touched on is the idea that innovation is not just a technological matter, but also something for the regulators to consider. And I think we've seen examples of that in the pandemic response. The need for regulators to be nimble and responsive and to step outside their comfort zone while still effectively regulating. And I think that was one of the interesting insights from you. And in general, we can see innovation, and with your reference to promoting broader production capacity, innovation, industrial policies, and health policies being themselves integrated. And I think this is the challenge, and I think this is why the responses we're looking at are also integrated. But let's get onto that subsequently, because we now hear from the medical devices industry, and in particular from Tanya Vogt, who's the Executive Officer of the South African Medical Device Industry Association. So Tanya, glad to pass the floor to you.
Thank you, and I'm very honoured to be here. Just to give you some context, and I think this is interesting to know because we're definitely one of those countries that are way behind in terms of vaccinations. We have a population of 58 million, of which only 2.78 million have been vaccinated. We've had 60,000 deaths so far due to COVID, and currently we are sitting in a third wave, deep in that third wave. In fact, as of yesterday, we had 12,000 people test positive just in one day. And over the last 5 days, we've had an average of 15,500 test positive. So when the pandemic came to our shores in March last year, I can honestly say we were totally unprepared. It was panic and pandemonium. And what we saw was car salesmen, donut sellers, advertising agents selling masks. There was a very real lack of understanding of the medtech sector and of the COVID type products, the standards, the specifications, the quality requirements of these types of products. Even healthcare workers and professional procurement personnel didn't know the difference between a surgical mask, a N95 mask, a KN95 mask. And we really had to scramble to put together proper specifications so that we could ensure quality, safe, effective PPE was procured. In this regard, we were very grateful for the World Health Organization set of specifications. And I think if that's one takeaway for those developing countries, and particularly those that have a less rigorous regulatory system than, say, in the developed world, that the WHO was certainly of great assistance to us. We also realized very quickly that we needed to collaborate. The private sector created a fund called the Solidarity Fund, and then through an entity called Business for South Africa, they started engaging with government. And this included all stakeholders. It included the pharmaceutical companies, the medical societies, the regulator, the ministries of health, of trade and industry, of science and technology, and the private sector, and a number of top consulting firms, many of which provided expertise and services pro bono. What we did was we developed a procurement portal where companies were able to log their credentials. We were able to determine capacity, both locally and internationally. And interestingly, South Africa is primarily reliant on imports of medtech. We have a very small local manufacturing industry. And with the huge upsurge in global demand, it became extremely challenging. There were no flights coming into South Africa. There were no flights leaving South Africa. So we needed to get together and we needed to engage with our import and export authority, who actually implemented a rebate. So all essential PPE products were provided a rebate. We needed to engage with various logistic companies internationally and locally just to get those freight and charter planes landing on our shores, bringing supplies. However, there were challenges. with the opening up of the market essentially to non-medtech suppliers who found their way in, although we do have regulations at this point in time, you only need a medical device establishment license to sell medtech in South Africa. We did find a number of counterfeit and poor quality products that were being sold into the market. And this caused a situation where our regulators started tightening controls. So on the one hand, it did have some positive effects, but on the other, what we did see that is particularly with regard to your serological and PCR diagnostic tests, because many of these were very new, even though they might have had emergency clearance, say, in the US or elsewhere, or were even registered in other regulatory jurisdictions, our regulator felt the need to have additional regulatory oversight, and not just of diagnostic tests, but even of masks, and then insisted also on local testing. And this did cause delays for access to market, and did create uncertainty for suppliers of these products. Another aspect that I touched on was around counterfeit medical devices. What we did also see is a huge increase in corruption, particularly in the PPE sector. What our government did was they implemented some emergency procurement measures and deviated from the usual procurement processes. And this opened up gaps for corruption. So this is a real area of concern. It continues to be a concern in terms of vaccines. Unfortunately, we do have security issues within South Africa, and a number of PPE products were stolen, and there are rumors that even vaccines have been stolen. So there is definitely a need for collaboration in that area. SAMED joined a consortium called the Health Sector Anti-Corruption Forum, and we're working closely with that forum as well as Corruption Watch to identify ways to mitigate against corruption. We also collaborated with the African Union at one point and supported the development of a procurement portal for PPE for other African states. So I think if anything, my take-home message here is that there is an absolute need, a huge need for collaboration, for sharing of best practice between regulators around the world, to really look at how we can implement regulatory convergence, and that individual companies don't try and implement their own rigorous requirements when others have been there and done that. And lastly, I'd like to talk about access of medical representatives. So although it was really challenging in the beginning to get access to PPE and sufficient PPE, what we did find is that the movement of medical representatives as essential workers, and even those allowed to continue manufacturing, was curtailed. We were basically forced to stay at home, all of us, except essential workers, and hotels were closed down, and there was limited movement of and transport around the country. And this limits access of medical representatives to healthcare facilities. We forget that in order to actually implement and ensure that medtech is used appropriately, you need to train healthcare workers. You need to have technicians on site who are calibrating, who are maintaining ventilators, for example, and teaching healthcare workers how to don gowns and PPE and use their masks appropriately. And when you restrict access of medical technology representatives to support these healthcare workers in the front line, you do hinder the training and support that is required for effective delivery of healthcare. So we very early on requested that medical device representatives, those that are patient-facing, be included in the first tranche of those that are being vaccinated. And we have had, I must say, quite some success in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tanya, especially for bringing us down to earth with that very practical, I might say heartfelt insight into the challenges that you and your colleagues have confronted throughout the pandemic. And again, picking up some very important themes. I think the importance of the regulatory framework and the value of WHO specifications, the collaborative framework you mentioned, and I think you stressed the significance of good governance policies or practices in procurement, which become not kind of dispensable in the case of an emergency, but all the more important for the reasons you've underscored, despite the challenges. And then a reminder of the importance of the flow of expertise and human capital, the sharing of knowledge that has, if you like, a human face and that does interact directly with regulatory matters, and for that matter, trade matters, as we know in current discussions in the WTO. So thank you. I mean, that's one of the important moral outcomes, I think, from this horrible experiences that we have an obligation to listen to and learn from those hard-won practical lessons. So thank you. We now pass to a colleague also in the health devices sector, a well-known company, Medtronic, Dr. Trevor Gunn, who's Vice President for International Relations. Trevor, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you to our colleagues from the WTO and WHO and so many of us here that have been focused on the pandemic and potential impacts, and of course, not only the present, but what can we do in the future. For those of you that don't know Medtronic, we are, I think, officially the world's largest medical technology company. But in addition to the statistics that you can clearly see on the left-hand side, we've been focusing, as many companies in our industry have been, a lot more on the solutions and how to get to those solutions. And many of those solutions will include technology, but will not be limited by technology, private-public partnerships, and the like. Very well. So just a few little trinkets, really, from the medical device industry, and particularly for those colleagues that may have little experience about our industry and maybe in far-flung destinations. At the end of the day, our mission as a medical technology company is to get medical technology to all who need them. And that means all who need them. It's a lifelong journey. We're making specific progress, but I want to make sure that these points are understood. Number two, you have to understand our industry is not made up of companies like Abbott and ourselves. Aaron did a fantastic presentation. Samed and Carlos from Brazil, great. You'll find actually at the heart of the industry are small and medium-sized companies that are infinitesimally smaller than ourselves. And at the end of the day, that's the litmus test for success or failure often, is around those small and medium-sized companies where a doctor or a surgeon can turn to an engineer, come up with a new device. Very interesting. So we're not confined by any particular scientific paradigm. And we think that all approaches are good approaches, and access is ultimately what we desire. We want to grow our industry globally, so we're not afraid of local competition. We think that it is great to have local innovation. In fact, we hope for innovation to come from the most unexpected and far-flung places of the planet. And please be assured of that. Access, and Tanya, I thought you did a fantastic job, despite the very difficult circumstances right now in South Africa, around the fact of human infrastructure. People realize that technology is technology, but what has been lost in this crisis is the value of the human being and the frontline healthcare worker. Yes, they're lauded, but are they really, truly given sort of the premium position that they actually deserve in terms of determining literally whether a patient survives or dies in a particular situation? I don't think so. I think that you can't do enough in this particular area to include the human infrastructure angle in all of this. And then finally, just a little tidbit around medical technology expenditures as part of budgets. And this goes to emerging markets. This goes to emerged markets. This is also applicable for private and public healthcare. So it's only about 7% of healthcare budgets go to that. The vast majority go to a lot of those operational expenditures in other parts of the healthcare ecosystem. I thought I'd focus just a few moments on what, in several of mentioned ventilators. So yes, we do produce ventilators. We are the third largest ventilator producer officially. However, we are the largest producer of respiratory technologies writ large. And yes, ventilators are this complicated, can be this complicated. That is how difficult it actually is. And one small change, and that could be a movement control order in it, which prohibits employees from coming into a particular factory, could have a decimating impact on a key component and here. And so I won't obsess too much around the statistics and the detail. These slides, I think, will be made available. But I want to look at this for our colleagues that are unfamiliar with trade or unfamiliar with ventilators, to talk about upstream and downstream supply, so we have a clear understanding of how complicated these things can be, right? You have multiple different countries coming into a specific location, final manufacturing location, say Galway in this particular example. Then you have sterilization procedures. They go to major distribution centers, and they go to regional distribution centers. Then, of course, it's the hospital, and then, of course, to the patient, and they're applied to the patient at the end of the day. Right. Some of the, Tony, some of the most important obstacles that we've encountered here, and this is a very busy slide, I know that, are here on the left-hand side. Some of these can be controlled by governments, some cannot be controlled by governments. We fully realize that, but we wanted you to understand at the end of the day, the full portfolio of problems we've encountered in different categories and how we actually dealt with them in Medtronic. My gut tells me many of our colleagues within the medical technology sector applied different approaches, some of the same approaches. We think those are all good. We have a very friendly industry, and we've been learning a lot from each other in the right way through this crisis, but let me keep it at that. I can, most vividly speak to Medtronic as a very mission-based company. We did a lot of, I would say, unusual things. We let go into a lot of intellectual property around a specific ventilator. We created something together with the WHO, where David Nabarro and Dr. Omari Shrock co-chair today, called the Global Respiratory Partnership, that should aid at least the information exchange between the private and public sectors to plan for those future situations. I think the WHO has been doing a great job, particularly in this, but other places as well. We technically went and did sort of unusual things. We partnered up with Intel Corporation, for example, to do something as simple as partnering to make sure that those healthcare workers on the front lines had the opportunity to look at multiple ventilators at the same time, given that human capacity was so low. Collaborating with others, so many different collaborations, from even in the public sector, from NASA to SpaceX to many other collaborating partners. So much was necessary through the crisis. We talked about not raising ventilator prices. That's important. In our CEO letter, we did that. And then we founded something, and back to Tanya's great presentation around human infrastructure, we founded something called the Ventilator Training Alliance. We asked 26 of our colleagues in the ventilator space, all of them willingly. We all partnered up together. We ended up chairing it and sort of taking the lead position here, but creating an app that actually was translated into 9 languages. That was downloaded in 200 countries, that enabled those frontline healthcare workers to deal with all manufacturers in a transparent and productive way. So that's Medtronic. My colleagues at the WHO, at the WTO rather, probably the WHO as well, but WTO for sure, asked about what's the future demand for some of these technologies. And I really want to point out something that I think is often being laid to the side in most discussions. And you could term it long-term COVID. You can talk about the effects that COVID has on other life-saving conditions, but there's a mounting, and I mean mounting, and actually a mound of literature, peer-reviewed now around COVID-19's actual impact upon the medical device sector. Some of them are here. I'm sharing them with you. We're very, let's say, through our experience with non-communicable disease on a global basis, we realize as a company that we have to be very modest around what and in awe of what COVID-19 can bring to public health. It does bring to public health. As such, and again, pointing out why it's difficult to look into the future about future pandemic supply chain problems, et cetera. That previous slide was really meant to address the first. How will C-19 actually evolve? Who knows? right? How far down are we actually going to go down that beautiful Greek alphabet when it's finished? We don't know. And where is it going tomorrow? We're celebrating here in the United States, but day in, day out, we're working with our friends in India and so many other places where they're literally having 1,000 people die a single day. Very difficult in Asia and Southern Africa as well. So I think we've made as much as we can probably do here. Let me just talk quickly about what I think to be some ideas around the WTO role. First of all, I think everybody can realize supply chains in this particular area are so much more complicated than they thought, both upstream and downstream. We definitely need the WTO's help, the WHO's help, UNOPS, anybody that will listen. We need your help to actually deter some of these unintended obstacles. And often because many countries in the world do not have fully developed medical technology regulations, we want to have a fully regulated market. We want to have the capacity in each country to assess in a fair and evidence-based way some of these regulations. And then, of course, regulatory agreements can and do help. They absolutely do. Many people have talked about it before, so I don't really want to say more, but this is maybe to add the voice from the medical technology sector. These are really, really important. In the middle of a crisis, when asking us to send ventilators to many forlorn places of the world, including to Africa and so many other places, the way to get regulatory approval, let's be honest with ourselves, ladies and gentlemen, was to have the president of the country on the tarmac welcoming us. It was not by mutual agreement with that particular country. We need to change that. And then, of course, I think that the WTO has a unique ability to convene colleagues in an emergency type way so that information can be shared much more quickly. Some of these technical barriers, and some of them may come subject to the TBT committee, maybe some won't. Whatever it is, but I think that's really important. Then, of course, tariffs. We need to call out the fact that even in this in this difficult situation, we've actually seen some large countries actually raising tariffs when we would have the commonsensical and humanitarian expectation that they would be lowering. I've gone a little bit too long, Tony, but there is my direct contact information. I welcome your criticisms, suggestions, and whatever you may have for us in the Q&A. Thank you, Tony.
Many thanks indeed, Trevor. And indeed, those very clear and well-structured, informative slides will, I gather, be available for everyone to consult. And there's a lot of useful material there and a very good overview, again, of the challenges. And I think, you've picked up some of the common themes and set them in, again, a practical context. I won't resume them now because we will have some time for a conversation at the close of the presentations. But I think you've introduced another really unfortunate aspect of integration, which is the idea that the COVID-19 doesn't attack us in isolation. It's unfortunately there are related to other ailments which worsen its effect, and of course the effects of long COVID, as you mentioned. So all the more reason for an integrated and systematic response. On that note, and we're very fortunate with our final speaker, because we now turn to the critical area, of course, of therapeutics, and one therapeutic that has been very much in the spotlight has been remdesivir, and we're very fortunate to have from Gilead our final substantive speaker, Hemal Shah, who's Director, IP and Trade Policy, Government Affairs and Policy at Gilead. So Hemal, thanks so much for joining us. Over to you for your perspective.
Thanks very much, Tony, and thank you for the opportunity to join today's important discussion. So Gilead's response to COVID-19 required proactive investments in research and development, and is really grounded in the company's deep expertise in developing and delivering antiviral medicines. So, Tony, I thought I'd take the opportunity today to provide a brief background on Veclury, which is Gilead's COVID-19 treatment, its manufacturing process, and key supply chain and trade policy lessons that we have learned through the process. So Gilead invented Veklury or remdesivir, which is the first and only FDA-approved antiviral treatment for patients with COVID-19 in the US. It is also approved by others, including the European Medicines Agency, or authorized for temporary use in approximately 50 other countries. Clinical trials provided evidence that Veklury can help hospitalized patients recover more quickly, reducing provider time and hospital resource usage, potentially also saving significant costs for healthcare systems. Emerging real-world data are also showing a mortality benefit for hospitalized COVID-19 patients who receive remdesivir. But right from the start, Gilead's goal has been to work with governments and with global health authorities to ensure rapid and broad access to Veklury to help ease the significant burden that COVID-19 has brought to the world. In fact, even before any clinical trials for COVID-19 had started, Gilead's manufacturing team began to prepare for large-scale remdesivir production and distribution in anticipation of supply chain pressures and really high demand. This included most of Gilead's $1 billion investment in developing and manufacturing the drug, which is remdesivir, last year. This was all done at risk even before the drug received regulatory approval. So why do I say all this? The manufacturing process for remdesivir is relatively resource and time intensive. It requires 70 different inputs, and the chemical synthesis process must be completed sequentially rather than simultaneously. The process itself requires about 25 chemical steps, whereas most other drugs require only half that number. Complicating the manufacturing process is the challenge of scarce raw materials with their own lengthy production time, and also the lack of specialized manufacturing capabilities, limited global capacity for them. So early on, our manufacturing team procured a steady flow of remdesivir's raw materials to preempt bottlenecks, supply chain bottlenecks, and begin production as quickly as possible. So in total, moving to the finished product at scale typically requires about 9 to 12 months. However, Gilead chemists and engineers refined the production process, shortening the timeline down to 6 months or less. Gilead also increased active ingredient batch size by 12 times, increased manufacturing capacity by over 100 times, partnered with 40 other manufacturers across 13 different countries to create really the fastest possible production network. And then while we ramped up production, we also continue to educate our global health stakeholders that any disruption to the supply chain could actually reduce the amount of remdesivir that could be produced, and in fact increase the time it takes to do so. Moreover, as remdesivir is administered intravenously in a hospital setting, production requires sterile manufacturing capabilities, which really limits the number of organizations truly capable of manufacturing it safely, efficiently, and urgently. So in addition, Gilead also signed voluntary licensing agreements with manufacturers in India, Pakistan, Egypt, to expand access to remdesivir in 127 low-income and lower middle-income countries, which have populations with limited access to healthcare. Our partners facilitated the production of low-cost, high-quality, high-volume generic remdesivir, having enabled access for over 2.3 million eligible patients in the developing world. All in all, to complete the picture, Gilead and its manufacturing partners actually have been able to meet global real-time demand for remdesivir since October of last year. I quickly wanted to share maybe 3 lessons based on this background from my experience. So first is really the importance of proactive stakeholder education on the need for coordination, on the absolute need for coordination, in fact, and partnership. Our experience shows that a closely coordinated global production effort is indispensable to ensure that these materials are efficiently allocated, processed, and get to patients in a timely manner in a crisis such as COVID-19. So I'll give you a quick example. A partnership with our voluntary licensees positioned us effectively to respond to the second COVID surge in India, which suddenly required double the amount of remdesivir to meet demand. We supported our licensees with additional real-time technical assistance as they increased their batch sizes, added new manufacturing facilities, and onboarded additional local manufacturers. Today, our partners have been able to turn around the situation in about a month, while Gilead donated about 450,000 vials of remdesivir to India in the interim to that ramp up. And at the same time, to alleviate any supply disruption to other countries dependent on our India-based partners, Gilead donated active ingredients to our licensees based outside India so that they could continue to supply to others despite India's temporary export ban on remdesivir, which has now, of course, it has been eased. This actually leads me to my second lesson or takeaway, which is the importance of global multi-source supply chains and the need for global stakeholders to commit to keeping them open. Veclory or remdesivir was developed in the US. Its drug product manufacturing, in fact, also takes place in the US. However, our ability to produce large quantities and meet global demand really relied on an international supply chain, which allowed for redundancies that enabled manufacturers to adapt to unanticipated spikes in demand. But their benefits can really only be maximized when policymakers commit to avoiding trade restrictions, thereby building resilient supply chains that are immune to risks. And maybe last and perhaps also relevant for the discussion at the WTO on the TRIPS waiver is that our intellectual property licensing program has actually brought to light several regulatory barriers to access and administrative barriers to access. Some of them were discussed in the last session. And even if enough product gets through open supply chains and through borders, we need to solve for things that come in later. So examples of these barriers include slow regulatory approvals, absence of procurement processes, and absence of funding mechanisms. For example, our licensee partner in Pakistan, in fact, did note last year that few countries had actually put in a system for procurement, and therefore they were not placing orders. Such issues could also have knock-on effects on political willingness to invest in disease and treatment education, as well as sustainable healthcare infrastructure and medicine distribution. But it was really encouraging to hear how we are all preparing moving forward and for the next pandemic. So in conclusion, as some policymakers have already recognized, a global crisis like COVID-19 is really best solved through global solutions. We really remain thankful for close industry government cooperation, as well as to our manufacturing partners to expedite the availability of Veclory remdesivir for patients around the world. I'll stop here and back to you, Tony.
Great, thank you so much, Hemal, and again for bringing us down to earth with this most important and concrete example of the challenges for distribution of therapeutics, a critical therapeutic. Thanks to the fantastic cooperation of our panelists, we do have some time now for a conversation, and frankly, I want to make the most of this wonderful panel and extract as much as we can from our colleagues. I thought one way of doing this would be to go through the common themes that have emerged, I think naturally enough, in these presentations, and ask our panelists to comment on these from two directions, I suppose. Firstly, looking at the WTO, but also the international system generally, because we collaborate very closely with our international partners. What steps, what procedures, what initiatives would be most effective, and secondly, what are the best ways of tracking in real time the problems that are encountered? We've heard a number of them already today, some of the specific issues encountered. The best way of tracking that in time so that the system can respond in a timely fashion. And the first area, and we have a comment in the Q&A panel. We have a comment specifically on this anyway, on the regulatory question, and we've touched on regulation of devices, of diagnostics, of therapeutics. Earlier today, of course, a lot on vaccines. So I wonder if any of the panelists would like to take up that further, and particularly in that practical context. We're not talking about refashioning the regulatory system or subverting the regulatory sovereignty of any of our members, but there's a strong push towards convergence, cooperation, these kind of ideas, and it'd be interesting to get your views on the role that the international community can play in promoting this. Also, the reference to regional convergence on regulation, because we know that to take a global approach may be too big a step to take, but certainly regional approaches to regulation, which I think Trevor mentioned, that also would be an important step. So who would like to take up that regulatory question? I can nominate you if you like.
Tony, if I may, I believe we do have a very important aspect here, which is indeed to promote convergence in terms of regulation and use the tools that we have available. Reliance was a very good example in terms of fostering and expediting registrations, use of GMP information from other countries. That was a good example. So convergence, integration of activities. And again, I think WTO could really make incentive for local expertise and knowledge sharing. That's something that we have learned, that when it exploded, the first signs of the pandemic, we couldn't get products anywhere. And the products that we could get, sometimes they were hijacked in scale somewhere in between origin and destination. So it's something that we today, we are okay with that. We have already looked for solutions and we found some. But in the future, there might be a problem in regards to that. That's one example. A second example, we really talk about global chains of value chains. I think that's fantastic. I always advocated in favor of that. But when you realize United States, for instance, has some executive orders where FDA, CDC, and some other institutions have to look for solutions for self-sufficiency conditions, what about the smaller countries, low, medium income countries, what they should do? So we don't have equitable distribution of some of the vaccines, devices, and so on. So I think it's important that WTO gets involved in this kind and promotes this kind of discussion. What is the right balance?
No, thank you. And one of the benefits of our conversations today is to help inform exactly that discussion. Another area, and of course today's workshop is also about transparency, indeed, of production chains. And one of the really interesting aspects of the current debate, I was listening to the WHO chief scientist this morning, Dr. Swaminathan, and one of the key points she made was the need to keep trade flows open. And of course, that's something you normally hear from trade economists, trade experts, but we've seen very concretely, and as you've mentioned, Carlos, the importance of keeping global supply chains open, and not from the point of view of pure trade economics, if you like, but from the point of view of ultimate equitable access. So I wonder if others would like to build on their comments in this area. I think everyone's touched on it in different ways. The significance of openness. I mean, Tanya's mentioned that when it comes to medtech, even a significant player like South Africa is highly dependent on imports. Would someone like to comment on the challenges of keeping supply chains open and the role again that the international institutions might play.
Antony, if I may.
Thank you. Please go ahead, Tanya. Yeah. Oh. Tanya, please go. Can you hear us still? No. Who would like to take up that topic? Sorry.
Maybe I can give a shot while Tanya, I'd really like from Tanya.
Yeah.
Oh, she's coming
I'm
back.
back. You go, Trevor.
Nope. You go first.
Tanya, please go ahead. We can hear you now.
Yes. So one of the things that our government did was they implemented export restrictions on PPE. And I think that was very misguided. And I would like to recommend that governments first consult with the respective industries that they're going to impact before they implement these measures that have huge potential negative ramifications for the movement of essential products. So that would be something that I would recommend. Also, we found that a lack of data almost is very, it hamstrings you, because if you don't know where the products are coming from or where they're going to, or in what capacity, or the freight and logistics pathways that are used, etc., how can you then make major trade decisions and not take those into account? So I would recommend that you really need to gather data. You need to understand the sector that you are impacting, and you need to consult with industry, and also consult with the other ministries of trade and industry in those countries that you are trading with, both that you're exporting to and importing from, to understand the impact of any changes to your trading policies.
If I could add just a moment on, I think Tanya said it very, very well. Please always remember the human. I have 3 points. Please always remember the human element in all of this. I made reference to supply chains being particularly vulnerable to some of the, what some countries have called movement control orders. We focused a lot on product, we focused a lot on technology, we focused a lot on, aircraft, trains, planes, etc. But at the end of the day, we saw actually some of the most vulnerable pieces being countries which woke up in the morning and said, "Oh, we've got too many COVID cases in my country." They clearly did. But then they cut off the entire supply chain, but a smart country woke up and had this crisis happen one time and then put like medical device exemptions in the next time that it actually happened. So we think that that's important. The second point, Tony, and you talked about this in your first question, I think we in the business community, and I think if we as humanitarians at the end of the day want to see that the organizations are working together. If I even look at procurement, I look at the first round, and you see vestiges of still in the second round. And I know, Aaron, you may have some thoughts about that from your perspective. We saw, frankly, more competition than collaboration. Different orders coming from different places, not understanding where those orders were coming from. So you can imagine already we're working with very, very, very strained supply chains. Trying to authenticate a particular order is not fun business. And to understand that may be coming actually in from 2 different organizations, 2 different countries, same order coming in from 2 different countries, or these type of confusion issues. It's not the type of slowdown that I think anybody wants. So anything that the UN type organizations, WTO, WHO, UN Secretary General's office, etc., could do to tighten up their collaboration is really good for us. And then finally, the issue of regulatory. Let's remember regulatory capacity, and particularly with medical devices. I don't hear that much from our pharma biotech friends on this, but I can tell you this is a major issue in Africa, across 54 countries for us, with a few exceptions. Again, trying to differentiate between the medical devices industry, regulation, and the capacity needed to judge the regulatory compliance and hiring electrical engineers instead of biochemical engineers. That's something very practical. But that's not limited to Africa. Many other countries in the world have insufficient regulatory frameworks for medical devices as differentiated from pharmaceuticals and biotechnology. We have a lot of respect for them, but this is an area where WTO, WHO could work a lot more closely. Adriana Velasquez-Peruman and some of the people on the previous panel could be great contributors to that.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to, just in the few remaining minutes, put a question to both Aaron and Hemal, who have underscored the significance of cooperation as part of technology transfer and the challenges of, well, we've focused on global production chains in tangible form, but Trevor, as you've underscored, it's the flow of knowledge that's also critical, the intangible component of these supply chains. And as we seek to broaden the base of production and diversify productive capacity to achieve greater equity of access, I'd be interested in your experiences from the perspective of Abbott and of Gilead, if you could just give us a few parting thoughts. Thank you. Aaron, would you have something to offer?
Sure, I can speak briefly on it. I think the big piece from my side is probably on the more tangible bit, and working in supply chain for my entire career, I can say, never having experienced the type of challenges we faced over the last 18 months. In terms of some of the knowledge-related trade issues, we saw, one of the earlier speakers pointed out that it only takes a single item to be missing from a product in order to have an entire factory come to a standstill. So, I mean, we had built new factories and hired thousands of workers to manufacture our diagnostic tests when a single material became constrained, and that material may not be classified as a diagnostic or therapeutic or vaccine related material in the trade classifications. We had to jump over significant hurdles to avoid that. So I think, one thing that I would maybe throw out from Abbott's standpoint is, just how do we address that as we move forward? Thinking about supply chains in their entirety and not just the movement of finished goods, everything from PPE all the way through, I think is something, open that's worth more consideration.
Right, thank you. And I think I can say that point is well taken. We'll have to reflect on collectively what we do about it, but I think the point is extremely well taken. And I suppose transparency of the supply chains that we've been talking about is a first step. Final word then goes to Hemal. Would you like to offer your thoughts on that question, please?
Yes, sure. Thank you. Thank you for that opportunity. I'll say three keywords here, right? Preparedness, partnership, education. You raised partnership. I couldn't stress enough on the importance of voluntary collaboration and partnership. So to respond to this crisis quickly and efficiently, voluntary partnership played a really important role. On the one hand, we could go to manufacturers, our trusted partners, tap into our decades-old networks, and really those with established track records to produce high-quality, low-volume, low-cost medicines efficiently and distribute them as well. The second factor is also absorption of technology transfer and who can do it safely, quickly, and at scale. The third point on partnership, on voluntary partnership, is that you can get together and make sure that you can build a secure supply chain, which protects against potentially dangerous counterfeits and substandard medicines infiltrating supply chains. But one other point I wanted to add on voluntary partnership is the importance of technology transfer, which you mentioned, Tony, as well. So in terms of voluntary licensing that Gilead spearheaded in the developing world, our licensees have the right to receive technology transfer of the manufacturing process for remdesivir. So this includes manufacturing process descriptions, specifications, methods, and stability data, all to enable them to scale up production very quickly. And there's also the importance of sort of close communication and constant workshops and discussions to enable real-time know-how sharing. So this again goes back to our point in addressing the second COVID surge in India that I made earlier. But really, yeah, just wanted to put forward that the importance of collaboration, partnership, and voluntary partnership at that.
Well, thank you very much, Hemal. Our panelists, I think, have exceeded our high expectations of them. It's been an incredible discussion. I've picked up so much from it. In particular, I think it's brought down to earth some of the more general issues we've been debating, and helped us understand from the perspective of these three key areas, diagnostics, therapeutics, medical devices, that we can learn a lot from the experience with the vaccine sector that we're focused on for much of today. But there are distinct challenges. At the same time, some very common themes come through. The human factor, the idea that technology diffusion does involve education and human-to-human transmission of knowledge, the complexity of supply chains and the need to keep those open, to understand that complexity and to see that as a vital aspect of the response to the pandemic, the impact of perhaps short-term and inward-looking measures such as tariff spikes, such as constraints on trade, having unintended and negative effects. And finally, something that's come up very frequently, and I suppose rightly so, is that of regulatory convergence and cooperation. And that's something that seems to span all of the sectors we've been looking at, and of course is a principle very much embedded in the WTO DNA, and certainly a practical responsibility for us to take up. But that concludes this panel. The panelists have been fantastic, and they've even brought us in exactly on time, which is very rare in Geneva. And that means I can pass also right on time to our closing speaker, which I'm delighted to say is Deputy Director General Angela Ellard. DDG Ellard, over to you.